Well, I'm here with a wonderful friend. We were just talking about where we met, and we've met 50 different times over 50 different years. But it's great to be here with Herman Milligan, and we want to talk a bit about the Givens collection of African American literature. We're here at the Anderson Library at the university where that is. And I wouldn't mind getting a little bit to you, Herman, who has sat on pretty much every board in town, hear a little bit about your journey. But let's start, if we could, by talking a bit about the Givens collection. We're both friends with Archie Givens, and it's a great legacy of his family's. And tell us a bit about this incredible resource.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. Historically, the family decided to buy a collection out of Harlem, New York. And there was a collector there who had a large collection of African American literature and other historical documents. And so what the family did was they got together with 7 other couples, and they created this group that then purchased that collection. And then the collection then was donated to the Elmer Anderson Library. Okay,
great. Well, it's an incredible collection. I've been to a couple of events here. How would you describe this to someone who doesn't know about it? And I've got to admit that it wasn't until about 10 years ago that I knew anything about this, and it's one of the great arts assets in the community. What do people find when they see it?
Well, for example, the collection has 3 copies of only 5 copies of the first book ever published by Phyllis Wheatley. Three copies are here. 1 copy is in University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I don't know where the 5th copy is.
Yeah.
So it's a literary collection. Baldwin, all of the writers, famous writers, first edition manuscripts, even probably handwritten manuscripts, poetry. So it's a really diverse collection of African American literature. And I think the real important thing is you can actually have access to it. So basically, you can go request, like you want to see the Phyllis Wheatley book, and then they can go get the book, and then they bring you the book.
Wow.
So I serve on the board of the Givens Foundation for African American Literature, and we have a Cultural Matters K-12 literacy program in schools. So at the end of this literacy program, we actually bring the classes to this library, to this very room.
What are the reactions from the kids?
And they just love it. So what they do, we even take them, the library takes us down into where the collection is, but they also bring up the books. So if you can imagine a room full of kids, and then these books are like spread over the table. And one time they brought up the Phyllis Wheatley book. But they didn't say like this is only one of 3, one of 5, right? But they brought them up, put them on the table, and kids went to the table, picked up the books, reading them. And so it's kind of fantastic, where this is an open library, really.
Right.
It's like an open source. You can actually go have access to this material.
It's really absolutely stunning to have that kind of asset here, and especially within the context of everything we know about opportunity gaps for African American kids in schools who for generations have been reading books that showed nothing about them. What you do at the Givens Foundation is about supporting the collection, but also more. I'm going to ask what sounds like a dumb question, but it's a straightforward one. What is the impact that has on an African American kid seeing literature that reflects them?
Well, it's actually for all kids. Yeah. So when we have our K-12 literacy program in these schools, it's like for everybody. So they're white, they're Asian, they're Native American, they're obviously Black American. So through my evaluations that I've found, that I've done, they have a better sense of their ability to write, to express themselves. to learn more about Black literature, to have a better appreciation for literary arts in and of themselves. Also, we incorporate a performance aspect where the kids can create a play out of the books that they read or the plays that they read. So this impact is really quite remarkable. And also, it helps the teachers because we bring in a literary teaching artist to work with the teacher in that classroom. And it's done for like 11 weeks. And then so you can, then what I do an evaluation of each class, and then I get this kind of feedback that they're writing, they're telling me, this is what I've learned, I'm so happy. And we've done performances for the parents as well. So at the end of each session, then there's a performance where the parents attend based on then they see a performance based on what the kids have learned.
When you say kids, too, I know that you do this with very young kids, but you're also about making sure that as kids grow up, they see themselves as artists, as writers on that. How does this work as you start to get into high school, where we lose so many kids who have a big dream and then don't believe that they can do it?
Well, that's a very important question. For example, I just learned this year, in which you may already know, that there's a separate high school system for those students who cannot matriculate in the, quote, normal high school. Right. And the city of Minneapolis has 13 of these schools. So we're now doing a cultural matters K-12 residency in the Menlo Park School, which is in the Eastside Neighborhood Center in Northeast Minneapolis. And that school has 85 kids across the 4 years of high school. So we're in there right now with those kids doing our 10-week curricula.
One of the things I know about those schools is that it's easy to look at them and say, these are kids who aren't as smart or aren't doing as well. It is really kids who aren't succeeding in a traditional system. And so a lot of those schools use very different learning approaches, which somehow turn a crank in someone in a very different way. So that idea of bringing in literature and having them see and express something differently in this alternative setting is really, really powerful.
So our goal is to basically do a K-12 literacy in each one of those 13 schools. Because for the last 10 years, we've only done them in what I call the traditional high school, right, or like grade school system. I mean, because I didn't know that this other system even existed.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things, too, that just in the education work I've done is it's very easy to look at a graph that shows race gaps on reading scores. It's a whole different thing to recognize that part of that is the way that the reading was taught and the relevance. And so I think that's why that's so.
And part of the evaluation that we've gotten back from the schools is that the students are performing better on their standardized Minnesota test, whatever all those different tests are. They are performing better than they did prior to taking this course. I mean, it's not that it's the only course that helps, but it does help.
So let's say somebody likes this. Can they write a check? Can they make a contribution to the Givens Foundation?
Yes, they can. Okay. Right. And this is a very important point you raised. We actually write the grant, so the school does not pay anything for the service. So they get that 11 or 10 weeks of instruction for free.
Wow.
Yeah, including the evaluation. So we get the support, for example, from the Minneapolis Foundation or the State Arts Board. I mean, yeah, so we do not charge them because we found out over the 8 or 9 years that this is a barrier. There's no money for a program like this in their schools because the arts have been, funding for the arts has been reduced. So one of the things that go out or would be a program that gets cut, it would be a program like this.
Herman, one of the things I also want to talk about is you and the arts community. You've had an amazing, amazing history here. Anybody who goes to arts openings in town almost always sees you and Connie there. I don't know how many you go to on that, but You have been on so many boards in this town. Help me remember all of them. So Milkweed, Juxtaposition, Walker.
The first board, I was never on the Walker board, but I was on so when Kathy Holbrosh came, she succeeded Martin Friedman, so she was the third Walker director. So she created the Community Advisory Committee. So that was, from her point of view, it was about how do we diversify the programming of the Walker? How do we bring everybody in? So there were about 20 of us from the community, and Setu Jones and Sue Catilla, they were like the staff who were managing. So we created, for example, so we came up with the idea of after hours.
Oh, really? Thank you for that. That's great. I can't stay full after hours, but late enough. 5:30.
Free first Saturday, second free Thursday, or it's this Sunday one, and then I think as you well know, when you know how institutions program, you have your budget. So all of a sudden, if you want to do something, what we call the sudden opportunity, well, there was no money. So what we did is with the Walker, we applied to Lila Wallace. And then Lila Wallace, for 3 years in a row, they would give us $300,000 a year for sudden opportunity funding. So then the curator, performing arts or film or what have you, then they would go to the community and find a community partner, write a proposal, and send us the proposal, and then we would review it and then fund it.
So as a parent who luckily was able to bring their kids to Free First Saturdays, that's the work of a community group.
Yeah, and then we also extended that to anyone who was on welfare.
Wow.
So they could even apply. I mean, to get free access to the museum and all of its activities.
We're in a moment where that is not so rare anymore for arts institutions to have community advisory groups. It took way, way too long. What was that like back in that period of time where it was trying to figure out how are you supposed to, quote unquote, represent the community? I mean, how do you really figure out what are the main points to raise? How do you bring those voices into an institution that has its ways of doing things?
It's actually pretty simple. It's you basically knock on the door of the community and ask.
All right.
What do you want? What's important to you? And not to know, and to act as if you're acting, what you're doing is you're learning from them as opposed to teaching them or telling them that there's something like they don't know that we're bringing to them. Because they do have knowledge, right? They have a knowledge base. They have a practicum of how they do their art or how they write, or it's just that they weren't getting the support that they needed from, quote, the main cultural institutions. And then what happens, then there's a collaboration so there's a mutual learning, there's an exchange of learning. And one of the things which is very interesting, and thank you for asking me this, so you remember there was a time when the Walker Art Center had to close down because they were doing a whole new renovation?
Right.
So they created the Walker Without Walls program.
Oh, right.
Right? Those communities in Walker Without Walls came from the original community, the Community Action Committee that we had when Kathy Holbrook, when they were first founded.
So many of the things that were groundbreaking at Walker came out of this one community committee.
Right, the community, like advisory committee.
Yeah.
So when they really closed down the Walker, there's a photograph. You can look at this photograph and you can see the listing of community partners that they were working with during the renovation or during the new construction of the Walker. And that's where those groups came from that allowed them to continue to have community programming while the institution was under reconstruction. Then the Guthrie did the same thing. So I was on the community advisory board for the Guthrie Theater when Joe Dowling was there, and at the old location right next door to the Walker. So it was basically a similar model. You bring in diverse community members, and you say, okay, how do we want to what do we need to do to bring in a more diverse audience to the theater, et cetera, et cetera. And that model he used the exact same model, and when he got to the new Guthrie, it was there for 2 years, and then it was disbanded.
So you've been in these positions where you've been bringing community voice onto a board. You've also been onto boards trying to help a board navigate opening up their way of thinking. Right now, I would say every arts board in town, most at least, and I think it's a good thing, most arts groups in town are trying very hard to not have to have an external community group that changes the core board, but have the board itself be much more responsive. You've learned a lot of lessons, and you've had to teach a lot of lessons on that. Think about having a voice to lots of those boards now. What do boards need to know about creating the climate within the board itself to make sure that it's much more responsive?
Well, it has to work on making sure they have as many diverse voices as possible. And by diverse, I mean the 360 degrees of diversity. I mean, that's gender, that's LGBT, that's military, that's females, that's race, it's everything. I think in our society now, there's a tendency to like slice it. So it's race, or it's gender, but it's really everything. Right. And if an organization can really leverage that sort of intelligence and capacity, you're going to be doing much better and important work down the road. I mean, so the return on the investment is going to be greater. I mean, so I'm not saying that that you shouldn't, focus on segments, but if you think about the broader segment of everyone being in there and who you're serving, that's going to push you. That's going to push you further down the road in terms of your goal. And there's a quick example with Milkweed. So I came on the board of Milkweed, and we, in the open book, and as you know, the Loft, the Literary Center. So we created a fourth organization to then buy the building, and then we own it. So the open book is owned by 3 nonprofits. So 27 years later, it's the only one in the nation.
Yeah, people from around the world come and try to emulate it. I don't understand why others can't. Why do you think it's been able to do that?
Well, because we had a vision and a mission, and then we actually got it done, and the capacity was to then, okay, how do you manage it? Well, you form a fourth nonprofit to manage it. And so now why other communities don't want to do that, I'm not certain. Maybe it's too much work for them, or maybe they don't think it's worth it, or, but I think maybe the real important thing is having trust in partnerships. So if there is a trust in partnerships where 3 organizations say, okay, we're going to partner with you together, we're going to partner together, and we're going to do this, then it's going to work.
It's funny when I reflect back on Open Book, one of the things that happens when you're at mayor conferences is that people sort of get jealous of things, and they'll say, how did you get that? So like, how do you get all those bike trails in Minneapolis? But increasingly they were asking about Open Book and how these organizations came together. And I think one of the things that I'm really curious about your insight in is when you figure out a way to get these arts organizations working together, people have to kind of set some of their stuff aside. Like you got, as I understand, Art Space and Juxtaposition working together when Art Space was coming into North Minneapolis. How do you help navigate the different missions and egos and organizations. How have you helped pull different arts groups together?
That's an excellent question. I don't know if I have an answer for it.
You can make it up for them.
I think it's looking at what would be the commonalities for the groups in terms of, okay, if they realize, like, if we do this together, then we're going to get X, you know, and that X is going to be, you know, brand awareness. It's going to be increased services to the community. It's going to be more dollars coming in, you know. So all those things, once they realize, like, okay, this is a really good opportunity for us. Now, it doesn't, but now there has to be some give and take. So the original model may not be the model that is what you wind up with. But if it's something that you wind up with that still works, then that's going to be real important. So if you're looking at the outcome right now with Art Space and Juxta, the original model or the original ideas is not the current action that you will now see over there. But it's close,
Right.
but not like how they ideally wanted it. But it's still close and it's still working.
Nobody gets everything they want.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, yeah, I think that's a really important way to put it. But what's really what's critical is that it actually got executed, and something got completed, and now the journey is making sure that it's going to last. You know, and then it's going to change. I mean, the form will change. You know, and so learning about the change will hopefully then inform the partnership in terms of, okay, how do you navigate the partnership down the road so that everyone is serving their constituents?
I want to finish by going back and then forward. The back part is I want to figure out, how did you get started in arts? How did you grow up with an interest in it? I'm going to finish by saying, what do we need to do in this town? So let's start with the first one.
Well,
Herman Milligan.
I was born in Brooklyn, New York. Grew up in Trenton, New Jersey from years 5 on. Third grade, I took the clarinet. But now I grew up as a African Methodist, like Episcopal, AME. So I sang in the church choir. I sang in the junior high school choir. I sang in the high school choir. Then I go to undergraduate at Madison, Wisconsin, get my sociology degree. And I thought I was going to have a job in Boston and Cambridge, so I went there. And for some reason, that job was not there for me, so I found another job. But then what I did is I learned photography. Let me backtrack. So in Madison, I played with the late Cecil Taylor, well-known jazz composer. So I used to play the tenor. So then when I went to Boston, living in Cambridge, in the evening I went to the New England Conservatory and studied saxophone and composition, and then picked up photography.
Just on the side.
Yeah. So Cecil Taylor then nominated me for a Ford Fellowship that was at the Center for Contemporary Music at Mills College in Oakland. So I knew I was coming here to work on my PhD. So that summer, 72, I guess, before I came here, I went out to the Center for Contemporary Music for 3 weeks, wrote some music, had to perform, worked on the Moog, blah, 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 blah. Then came here for graduate school, and I took my photography portfolio over to the art department, and I said, here's my portfolio, where should I start? And Gary Hallman, he was the one he said, go over there to this guy who was Saul Walker, and said, oh, you should start an intermediate. So I started an intermediate, And that was the first and last course I took in photography. And I took some more sax lessons, but then I said, okay, I have to work on my doctorate. And so I said, I'm gonna get it done and blah, blah, blah. So that's basically it. And then
So you're an artist at the core.
And then I did have a poem published in the Black Scholar in 71, 72. So I've got a lot of poetry out there, but not, a lot of my writings are really academic in terms of where they are published. They're in like these academic journals. You know, they're like sociological, like journal articles. You know, for example, there's one that looks at gender role and identification. And there's academic.edu, so you can go in this database, you look at your name. So that article that I published with these two other women has been downloaded over 100,000 times.
Wow.
Yeah.
When did you write that?
I wrote that back in 79.
Wow.
Yeah, something like that.
So you've got this amazing arts background. You wind up in banking?
Yeah, but from the research side. It's market research.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So to get the doctorate, you got to do research. You got to do qualitative. You got to do quantitative. So my research was the still word of prison, looking at the race relations and maximum. So the new inmate culture, race relations and maximum security prison.
Wow.
And but anyway, so but the warden allowed myself and another person, Anthony Calabrese, who was in the graduate program. So I piggybacked my dissertation off of a study that was looking at when Oak Park Heights was being built. The study was about, okay, if you had this new supermax, how would that impact your behavior in these other places, like Stillwater and this one and that one? And so the warden allowed me and Tony to go also do some photography. So we also took some pictures and, but anyway.
So you're the most Renaissance of Renaissance men.
I don't know if that's true, but for me, there's a philosophy of living that I do, that I want to live by. Improve the human condition. So whatever I can do, it's got to be, how do I improve the human condition? And the other part is justice will prevail. What is it that I'm doing that's going to ensure that justice prevails for anything? It doesn't matter if it's the environment, women, disability, whatever. So that's how I live my life.
So let's use that to take off on that last question about what needs to happen in this community. You've worked for decades in this community to help justice prevail. You've done incredible things for arts. We're at a moment. It's tough to almost understand exactly what the moment is, but there's a moment right here. When you look out where this community needs to go with all of that, I'm going to ask you the very simple question that's really complex. What do we need to be thinking about right now?
Well, thanks for that question. It's basically on a project that Gary Cunningham, you remember Gary Cunningham, he had the African American Men Project?
Yeah, Gary's a former board member and deeply respected at the foundation.
I was the co-chair of that.
Okay.
So one thing that we found, and I think this is universal, through all my volunteer work, people need navigators to help them sort of navigate the system. Okay, how do I navigate? Okay, if I do need to go find a social worker, how do I do that? I mean, I may not know how to navigate the system. And it could be for any reason. And I think that's still a huge problem. Even from working in the financial services industry. I mean, I was working Northwest, we bought Wells, one of the largest financial institutions in the world. Well, how does someone find the ability to save money to buy a house, or how do they know where to get a bank account, or how do you how do you get a mortgage? I mean, or being financially literate. I mean, we would go into like the second and third grade classes teaching about money. That's how early you have to do it. Right. I mean, most people don't know what an annual percentage in APR is. Now, an annual percentage, they don't know. So there's a lot of what I think are basic core things that individuals need. So for example, I was on the board of Women Helping Offenders. It used to be in the Sabathani Community Center. So one year I said, oh, what I'll do for you, I'll take off a year out of the board, you pay me and I'll do an evaluation of your clients. Right? So at the time of arrest, 96% of those women were not employed. 96% were not employed. So it's sort of like piecing together, taking the time, right? Yeah. To say, okay, now why are you in the situation, and how did you get there? One of the things about doing research in the prisons, before I would interview these people, most of these I had a chance to actually read their file. I mean, so in 35 minutes, I read their whole life, basically. Right. And then I know I'm going to go interview them in 10 minutes. Yeah, so it's like somewhere along the line, they weren't being, whatever the reason is, the systems, they weren't integrating themselves, or the help was not being delivered in a way to really help them. And I think it's interesting, like we're here at the university in the library, and in this particular, talking about this actual collection, the Archie Givens Senior Collection of African American Literature, because as I was saying earlier, okay, so if we have this program where these kids are in the schools, we're with them for like 10, 11 weeks, and then we can say, oh, by the way, now we can bring you to this collection and you can like look at the books, do whatever you want. But what that does is, now they know that there's hope. There's like, oh, I mean, this is actually for me. I mean, then it gives one, hopefully, the ability to, where the system says, okay, down the road, you're going to college. So when I was in Trenton, New Jersey, I remember this, I think I was third, fourth grade. My mother took me, there was a special meeting with my mother and my father, and they said, okay, looks like this kid, your son is ready to go to college. So let's start planning that. That started in grade 4. Wow. Now, I don't know how many people now at grade 4 or grade 3 or whatever, where that message is delivered. If that message is not delivered, then there's all these other messages that could be delivered, right? And some of them not so good. Well, I also wanted to thank you for taking the time to talk to me and get my insights, and also for the support of the foundation. I mean, it's been so critical. It really, so it's really a tremendous work that you and the foundation are doing.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Herman Milligan.